It was pitch black outside, maybe 5:45 on a Thursday morning. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress, planted my bare feet onto the cold oak floorboards of my bedroom, and stood up to go start the coffee. The very second my full weight settled onto my right heel, my knee buckled. It felt exactly as if I had stepped squarely onto a rusty framing nail left pointing up through the wood. I actually gasped, grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden dresser to catch my balance, and looked down in the dark, fully expecting to see a piece of metal sticking out of the bottom of my foot. There was nothing there. Just me, 73 years old, holding my breath, waiting for a sharp, blinding pain in the bottom of my heel to finally subside. That kind of pain does not just hurt your foot. It strips away your confidence. For the next hour, I limped around my own kitchen, favoring my left side, leaning heavily on the countertops while I waited for the coffee to brew. This was not the usual dull stiffness I had learned to live with after 3 decades of walking on solid concrete floors at the logistics warehouse. This was a sharp tearing sensation. Every step felt like a punishment. By the time the sun came up, the sharp pain had dulled to a heavy, annoying throb, but a quiet, lonely fear had settled into my chest. If you cannot walk comfortably in your own house, you cannot work in your yard. You cannot walk the perimeter of the hardware store. You cannot carry your grandkids. You lose your foundation. And when a man loses his foundation, everything else built on top of it starts to crumble. I tried to ignore it for weeks. I fell into the same trap that catches so many men of my generation. I told myself that this was just what getting old felt like. I figured that my parts were simply wearing out, and that wincing every morning was just the new tax I had to pay for turning 70. But you cannot hide a limp forever. My daughter Megan came over for a Sunday dinner, and she watched me walk down the driveway to grab the evening paper. Megan is an occupational therapist. She spends her entire professional life watching how older folks move, helping them keep their balance, and keeping them out of nursing homes. She walked right up to me, looked down at my boots, and told me to sit down on the porch steps. I told her about the mornings. I told her about the feeling of stepping on broken glass and how the pain seemed to fade by the afternoon, only to reset and ambush me again the next dawn. Megan did not look worried. She looked like she had heard this exact story 1,000 times. She told me I was dealing with something called plantar fasciitis. She explained it in a way that finally made sense to my stubborn brain. She told me to think of the bottom of my foot as having a thick, heavy bowstring running from the heel bone all the way out to the base of my toes. That tissue is designed to act like a heavy-duty shock absorber. Every time you take a step, it stretches to hold your arch together. But she explained that as we get older, and especially after we retire and stop moving as much as we used to, that thick band of tissue loses its elasticity. It dries out, it gets stiff. And here's the part that nobody ever tells you about what happens while you are sleeping. When you lie in bed at night, your feet naturally point downward under the blankets. For 8 hours, that bowstring at the bottom of your foot shrinks and tightens up. So when you wake up, swing your legs over the bed, and put your full weight on the floor, you are taking a stiff, cold, inflamed rubber band and violently stretching it with 200 pounds of body weight all at once. That is the tearing sensation. That is the nail in the heel. Megan pulled out her phone and showed me a paper she had read in a medical journal about foot and ankle research. It said that nearly 1 in 10 people will experience this in their lifetime, and the absolute highest rates are in adults over 60 who spend a lot of time sitting. My body was not breaking down. It was just tightening up from a lack of the right kind of maintenance. And the most important thing she showed me in that paper was a specific observation. It noted that folks our age who engaged in targeted, highly specific movements to stretch and rebuild the bottom of the foot saw over 70% of their pain vanish completely in just 6 weeks. Not masked with heavy painkillers, actually resolved. She did not just leave me with a diagnosis. She wrote down a sequence for me. She mapped out 5 specific stretching movements, followed by 2 extra strengthening habits. 7 things in total. and she made me promise to do them. I want to share every single one of those 5 movements with you today, exactly the way I learned them and exactly the way I do them on the rug in my living room. And I need you to pay very close attention to the 2 extra habits I will explain at the very end. Relieving the pain is one thing, but those final 2 habits are what actually rebuild the architecture of your foot so that the pain never comes back to steal your mornings again. The first movement Megan taught me did not even involve stretching. It involved breaking up the rust. I have a neighbor named Carl, an old mail carrier who spent 40 years walking miles every day. Carl had this exact same heel pain, and it got so bad he had to use a cane just to get to his mailbox. When I told Carl what Megan told me, this first step is the one that gave him his life back. Megan told me I needed to apply direct, focused massage to the bottom of my foot to break up the tight adhesions in the tissue before I ever tried to stand on it. She told me to take a regular plastic water bottle, fill it with water, and leave it in the freezer overnight. First thing in the morning, before taking a single step, I would sit on the edge of the bed, put that frozen bottle on the floor, and place my bare foot on top of it. I applied just enough downward pressure to feel it deeply, and then I rolled my foot back and forth over the ice from the heel all the way up to the toes. The ice killed the sharp inflammation immediately, and the rolling physically broke up the stiff, contracted tissue that had tightened up overnight. If my foot was not flaring up with sharp pain, I would use a hard golf ball instead of the frozen bottle. The golf ball digs much deeper. When I hit a spot that made me want to clench my jaw, I did not roll past it. I stayed right there, pressing down, making tiny circles for 20 seconds until I felt the tissue surrender and soften. I did that for 3 minutes on each foot, and the difference when I finally stood up was staggering. The nail was gone. Once the tissue was warmed up and broken loose, I moved immediately to the second thing on the list. This was a direct stretch to the fascia itself. For years, I thought stretching meant just touching your toes. I had no idea how isolated and specific you had to be to fix a problem like this. I stayed seated on the edge of my bed. I took my bad foot and crossed it over my opposite knee so it was resting right in front of my hands. With my left hand, I grabbed my heel and pushed it slightly away from me to lock the ankle. With my right hand, I grabbed all 5 of my toes and pulled them firmly backward, pointing them toward my shin. I instantly felt a tight pulling line ignite right down the exact center of my arch, connecting straight into the sore spot on my heel. Megan warned me not to rip at it, but just to pull it to the point of firm resistance and hold it there. I held that tension for 30 seconds, letting the stiff bowstring realize it was allowed to be long again. I released it, took a breath, and repeated it 3 times. By doing this right after the golf ball massage, I was taking tissue that was finally warm and forcing it to remember its natural length. It felt like untying a knot that had been sitting in my foot for a decade. But fixing the bottom of the foot is only half the battle. This brings me to the third movement, and it involves a part of the body I never would have blamed for my heel pain. I spent my whole life wearing heavy steel-toed leather work boots. Decades of wearing those boots, combined with walking on concrete, had turned my calf muscles into thick, unyielding blocks of concrete themselves. Megan explained that your calf muscle attaches directly to your Achilles tendon, which wraps under your heel and connects directly to that plantar fascia tissue. If your calf is tight, it constantly pulls on your heel bone, which constantly yanks on the bottom of your foot. You can massage your arch all day long, but if your calves are locked up, the heel pain will never stop. So I had to stretch the calves in a very specific way that connected the whole chain. I sat flat on the floor with my legs extended straight out in front of me. I took a regular bath towel, folded it lengthwise, and wrapped the center of it right around the ball of my foot, just under the toes. Holding one end of the towel in each hand, I sat up perfectly straight, locked my knee, and pulled the towel firmly toward my chest. The burn that fired up the back of my leg was intense. It started behind my knee, ran all the way down my calf, and hooked directly into my heel. I held that deep pulling sensation for 20 seconds. I did it 3 times. I was not just stretching a muscle. I was releasing the pressure valve that had been destroying my heel every time I took a step. Before I tell you about the 4th movement, which requires you to stand up and use a wall, I want to pause and ask you a direct question. I am sitting here telling you exactly what it felt like inside my own body, but I want to know what is happening in yours. I want you to go down to the comments right now and just leave a number for me. Type A1 if your pain is completely isolated in the back of your heel, right where you strike the ground. Type A2 if that pain creeps forward and burns right in the middle of your arch as the day goes on. I read what you write. Knowing exactly where your pain lives helps me understand what we are fighting against together, and it helps shape what I need to talk about the next time we sit down like this. The fourth movement Megan taught me is something she called the crossover runner's stretch. Now, I have done wall stretches before. You stand facing a wall, put your hands flat against it, step one foot back, keep the heel down, and lean in. Every guy who has ever played a sport knows that stretch. But Megan told me that standard stretch was not enough to fix the damage in my foot. Because of my knee pain and my old boots, I had spent years walking heavily on the inside edges of my feet. I had essentially collapsed my own foundation. She had me stand facing the wall and step my bad leg back behind me. But instead of keeping my foot pointing straight ahead, she made me cross my back foot over to the opposite side. So my right foot was actually crossed behind my left leg, pointing slightly inward. Then she told me to lean my weight forward into the wall. The angle changed everything. Instead of just feeling a generic pull in the back of my leg, the stretch biased itself directly down the inner side of my calf and fired straight into the deepest part of my arch. It forced my foot into a stable, strong position while the tissue was being lengthened. I held it for 20 seconds, 3 times in a row. It felt like I was physically unwinding years of walking poorly. I could feel the tension leaving the exact spot that used to stab me in the mornings. The fifth movement was the grand finale of the stretching routine. This is where we took everything we had just loosened up and stretched the entire chain at the exact same time. For this one, I took that same bath towel, rolled it up into a tight, thick cylinder, and placed it on the floor right near the baseboard of the wall. I stepped up to the towel and propped only my toes up onto the roll, leaving my heel firmly planted on the hardwood floor. With my toes forced violently upward into extension, I placed my hands on the wall and leaned my hips forward. Because my toes were locked in that upward position, the stretch bypassed the easy muscles and went straight to the root. It felt like a deep, heavy pulling sensation running from the back of my knee, straight through my Achilles, and spanning across the entire bottom of my foot simultaneously. I held it for 20 seconds. The first time I did it, I broke a sweat just from the intensity of the tissue finally giving way. But when I stepped back and put my foot flat on the floor, my foot felt light. It felt alive. The heavy, dead, painful sensation was completely gone. Those 5 movements gave me immediate relief. They gave me my mornings back, but Megan was very stern with me about what came next. She told me that stretching a weak foot just gives you a long, weak foot. The reason the tissue inflamed in the first place was because the tiny, invisible muscles inside my foot had become completely useless. Decades of wearing thick-soled shoes that did all the supporting work for me had caused the actual muscles in my arch to atrophy and die back. When those muscles gave up, the thick fascia tissue had to do all the heavy lifting, and it eventually tore under the strain. I had to rebuild the muscle. That is where the 2 bonus habits come in. The first strengthening habit is deceptively simple, but it is exhausting if you do it right. It is called a towel scrunch. I sat in a hard kitchen chair and laid a small hand towel completely flat on the smooth linoleum floor. I took off my socks, placed my bare foot at the very edge of the towel, and then, using absolutely nothing but the strength of my toes, I started grabbing the fabric. I would reach out with my toes, grip the towel, and pull it in toward my heel, bunching it up under my arch. I kept gripping and pulling over and over until I had dragged the entire towel under my foot. Then I reversed it. I used my toes to forcefully push the bunched up towel back out, flattening it away from me. It sounds like nothing, but after 2 solid minutes of doing this, the bottom of my foot was burning in a way I had never felt before. I was waking up muscles that had been asleep since 1980. I have a buddy named Arthur who started doing these scrunches while he watched the evening news. He told me that after a month he looked down at his bare feet and actually saw an arch where his foot used to be completely flat. He had physically rebuilt the muscular bridge of his own foot just by gripping a piece of cloth. The final habit is the one that changed the way I walk. It is a heel raise, but with a crucial modification. If you just stand on your toes, your ankles will naturally roll outward, putting all the pressure on the weakest parts of your foot. Megan handed me a standard yellow tennis ball. She told me to stand near the wall for balance, place the tennis ball between my heels, and squeeze my heels together to lock the ball in place. Holding that squeeze, I slowly pushed myself up onto my tiptoes and then slowly lowered myself back down, taking 3 full seconds to reach the floor. Because I was forcing my heels together to hold the ball, my weight was perfectly distributed. My ankles could not roll. It forced my calves and the deep intrinsic muscles of my feet to fire together in perfect alignment. I did 10 raises. My calves were shaking by the 8th one. But doing this 3 times a week reprogrammed my lower body. It taught my feet how to push off the ground from a position of absolute strength instead of a position of weakness. I remember the morning, about a month into doing this routine, when I woke up, swung my legs out of bed, and stood up on the oak floor. I braced myself for the nail. I waited for the sharp tearing stab in my heel. But there was nothing. There was just the solid feeling of a strong foot meeting a hard floor. I walked to the kitchen, and for the first time in over a year, I did not think about my feet. That is the moment you realize that getting older does not mean you have to quietly accept pain. It just means you have to start paying attention to the maintenance. If you are waking up dreading those first steps, I want you to know that you are not broken. You have just been driving a truck with flat tires and wondering why the ride is so rough. You do not have to live like that. Grab a water bottle, put it in your freezer tonight, and roll it out tomorrow morning. Take 15 minutes to show your foundation a little respect, and you will be amazed at how quickly it remembers how to support you. I am going to stay right here, doing my own stretches, keeping my own legs strong, and continuing to share exactly what works with you. Because we have a lot of walking left to do in this life, and we cannot let a tight piece of tissue keep us in a chair. Take care of your foundation, listen to what your body is asking for, and I will be here talking to you again very soon.